Since the start of the Total War Warhammer trilogy, one of the most consistent topics of complaint from the community has been focused on Siege gameplay. Critics have pointed to a variety of features and design decisions that have had a detrimental effect on one of the most important battle types in this series, and they've been the focus of discussion for years. So ahead of their full unveiling in Warhammer 3, and the Siege overhaul we all know is coming, I figured it might be a good time to talk about my hopes and dreams when it comes to settlement assaults, and where I think Creative Assembly really needs to concentrate their efforts on improving the game. Certainly, not all my suggestions here will make the final cut, and it's entirely possible none of them will, but I think a lot of us have lofty expectations going in, and while it's always a smart idea to curb those somewhat to avoid that bitter taste of disappointment, I also know their team has the talent and the resources to deliver some super cool stuff in Game 3, sieges that would make the old ones and the Chaos Gods proud. Now in the background you can see some of the amazing cities our modding community have forged over the years, many of which have been featured on my channel before, and a common thread that binds many of those videos together is the question, why can't CA do stuff like this? Well, the answer is they can, but contrary to what some of us seem to believe, it actually makes perfect sense that modders have designed better looking siege layouts than Creative Assembly themselves. Modders don't have to worry about AI pathing to the same extent devs do, or about performance and graphical fidelity holding up across a wide array of machines. They don't have to follow the same stringent guidelines to dictate whether or not a map is considered campaign playable. They're free to go as wild and as far as their imagination can carry them when it comes to creating these gorgeous pieces of eye candy. They can spend hundreds of hours perfecting the visuals of their single siege map purely from a place of passion, without worrying about deadlines or the state of the overall product itself. They simply don't need to focus on a variety of factors at the same level of specificity that a professional game dev does. With that said, it's clear the vast majority of the community desires more than what Warhammer 2 Sieges have offered so far. They want more out of Warhammer 3's Siege gameplay, and to that end, let's discuss some of the major changes that should be on CA's radar as they make their grand debut in the next several weeks. And coming in at number 5, it's time to rethink how walls function. Everyone remembers the infamous dwarf announcement cinematic where salvos of cannons from the ramparts greeted the dastardly greenskin invaders, scything them down by the hundreds and sending their spirits to Gork and Mork where a Shumi afterlife awaited them. It was an unbelievably epic moment, and rightfully, many of us figured such a feature would be included in Game 1. Unfortunately, 5 years on and there's been no sign of wall artillery coming to fruition, which is all the more baffling because many previous Total War games already had the feature. In Rome 2, Attila, and several other Total War titles, onagers and scorpions and a variety of different catapult types could be placed on a wall to rain down hell on invaders. And that was true in games where factions weren't built from the ground up around their incredible artillery options. But in Warhammer, factions like the Empire, and the Dwarfs, and to some extent Cathay as well, rely on their artillery to deal damage and even the odds before melees joined. And in the current state of Warhammer 2, great cannons and many line-of-sight artillery pieces are utterly useless as defenders, because they can't get an angle to fire at attackers from within a city's walls. But give them a place to perch near the front gates from an elevated emplacement, and suddenly, Dwarf Carracks and Empire cities will become a lot more fun to defend. By the same token, there are other Warhammer races that can't even utilize walls right now because they can't climb them. Head of the Ogre Kingdoms making their triumphant belly-flopping debut, we need to think about how Siege gameplay would go for them, and I can tell you right now, Sieges were a goddamn nightmare when I messed around with a full Ogre mercenary stack in my recent Grimgore campaign. I had no units that could actually scale walls. All I could do was shove my entire army through a tiny gatehouse while Dawi fired cannons from the rear and crossbows from on high. All the Quarrelers and Thunderers above the gatehouse were untouchable, so you have a bunch of low armor, massive hitbox monstrous infantry milling around, unable to push past each other or push through the opposition, getting wrecked by units they can't even attack because of some arbitrary nonsense that says they can't go on top of walls. Their models certainly have room to fit up there, and if that continues to be an issue, make the walls wider. But even with the addition of Noblars, taking the walls with Ogre Kingdoms will prove an exceedingly difficult and frankly an unfun task if monstrous infantry isn't given the ability to attack them. It's not just about ogres, it's about Throg and Wintertooth or any other army composition that relies on monstrous infantry. Moving past that for a second though, there are a couple other features about walls that don't quite sit right with me. First, ranged units garrisoning a section of battlements should obviously be able to fire both directions, no matter which part they're standing on. The fact that units on the interior portion can only fire towards the capture point, and units on the outer portion can only fire towards the outside of the settlement is completely asinine. I should be able to double line fire with my crossbows towards the attackers when they're marching towards my walls. Duh. It's been like that in every other Total War game. I have no idea why it works that way in Warhammer. And creatures like giants and Kolek Sun Eater should be able to attack walls as well, not just the gatehouse. It's already been done in SFO and other mods. It needs to be a feature in the base game. Not just because it's an important part of lore, which it is, like when Kolek smashed the battlements of Prague, but also because it's exactly what a new player would expect a massive wall-sized creature with a huge hammer would be able to do. There's a sense of readability that's currently lacking when you look at a monster like a Dragon Ogre and aren't given the option to
tear down this wall.
At number 4, Creative Assembly needs to encourage tactical diversity with new layouts. I'd say one of the biggest points of contention when it comes to siege gameplay in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 is how boring and cookie-cutter the layouts for settlements are. And this has detrimental effects on both the immersion side of Total War, where seeing a High Elf settlement with the same exact blueprint as a Skaven or Greenskin settlement is pretty jarring, and on the gameplay side of Total War, where only certain unit types are considered viable or effective in a siege scenario. For me, the cookie-cutter layouts that are shared across all factions in the game wouldn't be such a buzzkill if they afforded more tactical variety and gave players choice when it comes to their army composition and approach to battle. Unfortunately, they don't really, and it mostly boils down to their incredibly choke-pointy nature that offers very little in the room of space to maneuver or gain line of sight for artillery or gunpowder troops. Most of the streets and causeways that comprise Warhammer 2 siege maps are little more than glorified alleyways, which combined with Total War's somewhat janky pathfinding, charge, and fire at will mechanics, is a recipe for very unsatisfying battlefield experiences. The streets of every major capital in the game are tiny. They're almost claustrophobic. You can't even spread a single regiment of infantry out to their normal width to defend most of the avenues inside. Musket troops can't fire over the ranks of units ahead of them, artillery can't gain line of sight, there's no room to flank, there's no room to wind up for satisfying cav charges. Many unit archetypes are utterly useless in siege scenarios, and that isn't just limited to cannons. Even units like Iron Drakes, which are quite literally the ideal, the quintessential choke point defender in the setting and the lore, need to finagle and reposition constantly to even have a hope of having a handful of their models fire. The way breaches work in broken segments of wall often prevents them from shooting their weapons at all. The gates are too small to allow for massed cavalry assaults where the Knights of Bretonnia can sally out and plunge their lances into invaders, and they certainly can't use their cav effectively inside the city because their city layouts are the same as the Dwarfs, a faction that doesn't even have cav. How can you expect Bretonnia to put on an impressive defense when they can only ride 5 or 6 men abreast on the main causeway of their own capital? It doesn't work. And so we're left with uninspired designs that don't allow factions to utilize their strengths, which in turn further encourages players to go for the tried and true method of single entity doom stacking in many situations. There are many units in Warhammer that would be viable in different scenarios, but they can't be used in sieges, and so people just don't bring them because sieges are the most common battle type in mortal empires. But it's not just a gameplay problem, it also misses the mark on the grandeur and scope of what Warhammer is all about. You take a look at these towering cities in the background and these awesome elevated spaces that would be incredible to play, and then you realize that none of it is actually a part of the battle map itself. It's all eye candy. Obviously, we shouldn't expect all those spaces to become playable, and they do a great job of adding to the spectacle in a game mode that will always be limited by a multitude of factors, but incorporating some of those elements into Warhammer 3 siege maps is important. Open up the layouts of each settlement. Give players more space to maneuver, to utilize their cavalry, to create enflating fields of fire where multiple gunpowder regiments can shoot in from different angles. Give us elevation inside and secondary emplacements within the walls, where ranged infantry would be encouraged to fall back to and gain line of sight over the opposition. Highlight the grandiose, over-the-top nature of Warhammer with massive causeways, huge bridges overlooking courtyards, and more avenues of attack towards the central capture point. Give us cool areas to fight over, not bland, narrow, and lifeless alleys where you can't maneuver at all, and it will go a long way in encouraging the tactical and unit diversity this series is so well known for. At number 3, give us a reason to layer the defense and use every available portion of the gameplay area. One of the most important issues currently facing sieges is that walls are a death trap. Defending the walls is quite literally a disadvantage for defenders, which is obviously completely illogical. You're better off just crowding the central plaza with your entire army in almost any situation, but especially when you're outnumbered. Now, this is a complex issue. There's a variety of reasons for this, and it may not even be fixable without screwing up other parts of sieges, but it's still an important element to point out. Ass ladders are a huge piece of the puzzle here. Quite rightfully, they've been memed since their inception. There is nothing more comical than seeing a horde of spectral banshees pull 30-foot tall ladders out of their collective buttholes. But I'm actually going to break with the community here and argue that ass ladders, while certainly not ideal, are somewhat necessary for allowing attacking siege AI to perform its basic functions. If you've played Medieval 2 before, you'll know that the Mongols are famous for building 3 or 4 ladders, a handful of siege towers, and a battering ram or 2. And inevitably what ends up happening is that they'll throw a couple of units at the walls, quickly lose them, then abandon any further assault there. The entire battle will then hinge on what happens with the battering ram. If it breaks the gate, the entire army will drop what they're doing and bum rush the breach like moths to a flame. If the battering ram gets burned down along the way, too bad. The entire army ends up milling about, doing absolutely nothing, completely unable to comprehend what just happened. This is the reason ass ladders exist, because the AI is absolutely hopeless without them. Is it gamey, simplified, and stupid to see them without any prior warning pull ladders out of their butts? Yes, of course. Do we all want better siege AI? Yes, of course. But I believe that some sacrifices do need to be made to make for fun siege gameplay, and no matter what improvements CA throws their way, the AI will always fail to present a meaningful challenge when attacking unless each and every one of their units has the ability to scale walls. I get why people don't like them, and I agree with you, but I'd argue ass ladders need to exist. The problem that then arises, though, is that the walls become little more than a roadblock for attackers. You'd think that scaling a 50-foot tall walls crewed by battle-hardened defenders would be brutal, but the reality is that it's actually super easy, barely an inconvenience. And once the walls fall, you realize that the lives expended trying to defend them were mostly wasted. How do you fix this issue? Well, you encourage players to utilize a defense in-depth approach by creating layouts that make people want to begin the battle at the walls, then slowly yield ground as they break the momentum of the attack and move backwards towards the final capture point. By creating strong points with overlapping fields of fire, places of elevation, and wider causeways as we described earlier, defenders will start at the walls to make use of their artillery, then move further inside the city to make use of the interior fortifications and secondary fallback positions, which creates a much more dynamic and interesting type of siege than the ones we currently have, which are very static and only revolve around the final capture point. I mean, defense in depth isn't possible for most vanilla siege layouts right now. They are very shallow layouts, and the capture point is only a stone's throw past the walls, so you can't layer your garrison in a way that actually makes efficient use of these maps. There's also the obvious point that units need to route the correct way. Think about how dumb it is that attacking units will route by climbing up the ramparts and running into the center of the city, while defenders will sometimes run out the main gate right past the enemy army. Obviously, that's completely flipped on its head and should not work that way. Attackers should route outside the walls, defenders should automatically retreat to a central capture point within. Which brings me to morale. This series has incredibly wonky morale, and combat resolution, while not the fastest in Total War history, can be quite quick, even for elite tier units. I would argue that defenders should have higher morale baseline, and that a huge increase of leadership at the final capture point should exist, to help counteract army losses. There is nothing that kills my lore boner quicker than having an elite regiment of Phoenix Guard and some Sisters of Avalorn working in concert, capable of wrecking insane amounts of enemy value together, then watching as they flee with their tails tucked between their legs because another Chaos army came in and swung the balance of power too far. The current version of army losses sucks. It kills battles way too early. It's poorly implemented and it needs a rework, but that's a video for another time. If you're going to keep it in its current form, then you need to give defenders higher morale. Of course they should have higher morale. They're defending from inside a fortified position, and they should have a huge increase at the final capture point to help them counteract the army losses penalty. Those epic last stands in the face of overwhelming odds are almost completely absent in both campaign and multiplayer, because defenders who have nowhere left to run and are known for fighting to the death aren't given the capability to actually hold their ground. If you remember, back in Medieval 2 in Rome, defending units at the final capture point were literally unbreakable, which makes some sense when you consider that these people's homes and families will be burned down and murdered if they don't hold the line. I'm not sure they need to be made literally unbreakable in Warhammer 3, but big boosts to leadership that could counteract the army losses penalty would make for some really cinematic and entertaining last stands that we just haven't been able to experience in the first 2 games of the series. And that's a shame, because this is Warhammer, and epic last stands is kind of what it's all about. Coming in at number 2, we have the age-old design philosophy emphasize the difference between races. This is perhaps more of a pipe dream and is becoming increasingly unrealistic in a series with so many playable factions, and I don't think we can honestly expect 15, 16, 17 distinct races to each have their own unique layouts that cater to their specific playstyles. I think that would just be an incredibly immense undertaking that might not even be possible. But in an ideal world, each race would have a handful of special blueprints for their settlements that suit how they like to approach siege warfare. In their current implementation, Dwarf Carracks don't really look or play like Dwarf Carracks. It's exceedingly difficult for them to bring their massive firepower to bear. But if the outer walls for gunpowder factions were changed from straight fortifications, which have tons of blind spots and line of sight problems, to Bastion Fort or Star Fort style battlements that stick out from the main section of walls, then those blind spots would be eliminated, and there'd be more room to utilize gunpowder troops in the opening stages of the battle, creating kill boxes and the ability to enfilade down the length of approaching enemy formations. Not to mention actually fire units that are in the process of scaling your walls, which is something that they simply cannot do right now with the way siege layouts work currently. As I've mentioned in the past, bigger causeways to allow cavalry to maneuver would be extremely beneficial for mounted factions like Bretonnia, and there's no reason to stop there. Ramps that allow Grail Knights to charge up on top of the ramparts would be pretty damn sweet, as would significantly larger gatehouses, so that large regiments of cav don't get bunched up and forced to single file when they're trying to sally out and charge into attackers on the open field. They lose all of their ability to quickly strike if they spend minutes at a time trying to just move through that tiny gatehouse. This approach to design also holds true for attackers as well. Right now, every race that has artillery will just move their entire army over to one edge of the map so only 1.5 towers can fire, and they'll just camp there until every enemy tower and wall segment is destroyed. It's an incredibly boring way to play, but it's effective because every fortification in the game is a straight line with limited arcs of fire that can somehow shoot you when you're still in your deployment, so everyone approaches these battles the exact same way. Giving attackers more options on the assault, like miners being able to tunnel under walls, or ethereal units being able to phase through walls, or spider and rat units being able to quickly scurry up walls, would open up a variety of racial-specific tactics that would make sieges much more dynamic and much more entertaining. It would add a lot of replayability to the series. There's almost infinite room to explore here, and I'm sure many of you guys have some cool ideas as well, but taking the baseline steps necessary to create faction-specific layouts conducive to how each race conducts warfare would be a huge step forward for the series. And finally, at number 1, there isn't much to say here, just fix the gate bug, please. More annoying than artillery shuffling forward to shoot towers when they're already clearly in range and already clearly have line of sight. More annoying than seeing your Wind of Death bounce off an invisible hitbox and careen into the night, killing nothing. More annoying than any other specific bug in siege scenarios is the ever-present gate bug that has existed since time immemorial. If you've ever had an awesome elite unit or monster move towards the enemy gate, eager to smash it down and feast upon the defenders, then watched in horror as those very same gates opened wide, allowing your giant or blood knights or other single entity monster access to the interior, only to then be cut off from the rest of your army and slowly chewed up and spit out and booed off stage, then you know the feeling of helplessness and the complete illogical nature of this bug. It's a feels bad man through and through. Essentially, the AI garrison is too close to the gate, so the gate opens, your unit goes through unbidden, the gates close behind them, and now they're forced to fight an entire army by themselves as you desperately try to break them down before you lose that unit completely. But the gates are now swinging open and closed, and even when they're open, you can't force path reinforcements through. The game treats them like they're shut, yet somehow attacking the gate is even less effective now because the hitbox gets all wonky and you're dealing even less damage to it now than you were a few moments ago, and you're just wondering what the hell's going on? Is the AI trolling you? Are they hyper intelligent? Like, why does this still exist, even though we know it's been reported since 5 years back? It was reported all the way back in Warhammer 1 5 freaking years ago, and to the best of my knowledge, has never been an issue in any other Total War game besides Warhammer. Please, fix the gate bug and let us no longer fear for the safety of our monsters and our elites, who are so often swallowed whole before their time has come. Thank you. And that's it. If at least some of these issues are addressed moving into Game 3, then I think Siege gameplay has an opportunity to thrive and no longer feel like the pleasureless grind that it's been for so long. Sieges are important. They're probably the most played battle type in Mortal Empire's campaign, and yet they're the most reviled because they're so limited and always play out the exact same way. With a bit more love, a bit more care, and a bit more attention, I can see them becoming truly great and vastly improving the Warhammer 3 campaign experience. Let me know what you all would like from Sieges in Game 3, and I will see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.